yesterday we went over the introduction to the ordinary object painting. So we talked about pop art, we talked about a couple of different pop artists, we talked about Jim Dine, remember we referred to Andy Warhol and the soup cans. We also talked about surrealism. Remember we talked about Rene Magritte. Rene Magritte is the one that did the Granny Smith apple inside the tiny room, or the big apple in the room. And so we talked about various ways that we could take an ordinary object or something that was pretty common, something we didn't usually give a lot of thought to, certainly something that we wouldn't necessarily perceive as good looking or beautiful, and ways that we could show them in a more interesting way. So remember, what were some of the ways that we showed examples of to make a boring or ordinary object appear more artistic or more interesting? What were some of those ways that the artists that we looked at did that?
Surrealism.
Okay, hold on. Luke?
By like making it hard to see what it is.
Okay, so stylizing the proportions a little bit so it's not like 100% realistic looking. Yes?
Using colors that you would normally think of using.
Using unrealistic colors or exaggerated colors, absolutely.
I said surrealism.
Surrealism, so what are some characteristics of surrealism that would apply to this? What do you think? Think about like the apple in the room that we just talked about. Why is that special? Or why is that different or unique or eye-catching? Yeah, because they changed the proportions, right? So it was either a really big apple in a normal size room, or it was a very teeny tiny room with a normal size apple. Okay, so kind of changing up those proportions to give it that surreal feeling. Yes, Julian, what were you gonna say?
Shadowing.
What about the shadowing?
Like shadows, like also like shadowing. I'll say.
Well, that's the perfect segue into what we're going to talk about. So I'm glad that you got something about shadows from what we talked about yesterday. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to go on from, remember we did that big brainstorm where we kind of pooled all of our ideas for ordinary objects or things that we could think of that maybe were very common, that didn't get a lot of our attention, that weren't necessarily made to be beautiful or good looking. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to take that list and go do some image research, okay? We're gonna look up photos of these objects, or if you come up with other examples, certainly you are welcome to expand upon that list. But I wanted to show you some examples of different paintings that would represent kind of what we're aiming for with this project, okay? So what is this object? It's a shoe, right? Now this one I happened to paint from life. I painted all these, by the way. These were my demo paintings, so these all represent like half an hour to a full half hour's worth of work. Okay, so they're not finished by any means, but you get the point. So this one I happened to paint from life instead of from a photo. Okay, you guys are going to work from a photo, and that's why we're going to do image research in the lab today, so that you can find photos of some of these objects. In fact, you're going to find 20 photos that you can use as reference. What do you notice about this shoe, though? What makes it interesting or strong or recognizable? What do you think?
It has like a lot of colors, so it makes it stand out.
There's a ton of colors happening in here, right? And they're certainly not recognizable, realistic colors, right? They're just kind of colors that are kind of what we call arbitrary, meaning you can kind of just pick what you want to put where you want to put it, and they're kind of made up, right? Julian?
Again, shadowing in the front of the shoe and back of the shoe.
Shadowing in front of the shoe and in back of the shoe. So we see a shadow here. I know my hand is kind of covering it. We see a shadow here, which kind of represents that there's a light source coming and hitting this shoe at some point, right? Which, since I was painting, I literally took my shoe off and plunked it on the desk that day. So it really did happen that way in real life, that there was a light source. And we see dark spots in the back of the shoe that balance with the dark spots in the front. Okay, now notice that these shadows, those of you that are up close, what colors are these shadows? They're not black.
They're blue.
Dark blue, purple, okay? So those are the darkest colors on the color wheel. Think back to when we did color practice pages 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 was color wheels. So you're gonna use your darkest colors on the color wheel to be the shadow areas. And we're gonna use the lightest colors on the color wheel to be the highlight areas. So what color would that be in the highlight areas?
Yep.
Yellow, lightest color on the color wheel, okay? Here is another example. Okay, so you can see similar execution, similar method, different object, right? So what did I do in the background of both of these? In fact, I did it in this one too. I did it in all of them. What's happening in the background of these?
There's gradients kind of.
There's gradients. Yes, most important, okay? It doesn't have to be a smooth gradient. This one looks kind of on the smoother side, especially I guess if you're looking from a distance. Up close, it's pretty chunky actually. This one, this is a pretty good example of, I just biffed myself in the head, of what we call painterly brush strokes, right? So even from way back there, like where Luke and Gavin and you guys are sitting, you can tell where the brush strokes are, right? They're pretty bold and chunky. They're not really refined and blended in. These ones are a little bit more blended. Okay, and sometimes we kind of fall into that habit of blending because we're used to kind of seeing things that way in real life. But your brush strokes can show, and that's something that you guys learned with the last project where we did the Xing. Okay, you might not do actual X's this time, but the idea of using your brush strokes to leave that texture showing is going to be a very, very similar technique. Okay, similar. You know, very, very similar technique happening here. This one, the paint got watered down a little bit, so it has a little bit of a more like watercolor feel to it. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would recommend just using your paint straight acrylic, leave it thicker so that you get a little bit more buildup of paint on the surface. Okay, what do we see about this one?
Really dull.
Much more dull colors, right? So that means using those complementary colors. When we blend colors that are opposites on the color wheel, they're going to get neutralized. They're going to get a little bit duller. They're going to get de-intensified. These duller, more muted colors, that's when they use complements to dull each other, they tend to look a little bit more realistic, which isn't necessary for this project, okay? So if you want to eventually be able to paint, like when Drawing and Painting is doing the still life right now, and you want to eventually be able to paint more realistically, that's certainly something that you can try. But at this stage of the game, at this level for this particular project, we want that really ordinary object to look extraordinary, to look interesting, to look, you know, engaging or appealing or eye-catching, okay? So don't feel like you have to for this, okay? What about the background? What do you notice that there is in the background? See you all going like this, right? There's kind of a horizontal breakup of that space, okay? What does that suggest about the object?
Table.
Suggests that it's sitting on some sort of table or some sort of surface, okay? So basically, it visually tells you, okay, this object and this ground surface are in the foreground, and then whatever this is happening back here is in the background. So it gives a sense of space and it gives a sense of depth, okay? That's really important. So when we're doing our image research, we want to look for objects that are photos, first of all, okay? We're not going to use clip art, we're not going to use drawings or cartoons or other artwork. We want to make sure that we're working from photos, actual photographs, okay? But we also want to make sure that in those photos we can see a really strong sense of highlight and shadow, because we need that information in the photo to refer to so that we know how to paint it accurately, okay? Because as you guys can see, it doesn't matter if the colors are realistic or not, as long as you have highlights and shadows in the right place. You can still recognize what these objects are, right? Okay, this one I did from life also. I had this wine glass on the back counter back there. So you can kind of see this is counter, this is the little backsplash, and then this is kind of the wall color back there, and there was a light source on it at the time. Okay? What's weaker about this one? It's missing something that some of the other ones had.
A shadow, like if it's sitting on something. does
It's not
shadow.
grounded, okay? This kind of looks like it's floating in a mysteriously dark, colorful space, okay? Which is fine, but way stronger is gonna be if you have a shadow, if you have some sense of where that object is grounded, where that object is within a space, if you can kind of create that sense of space. If you look on, I know you don't have this out in front of you, but if you look on your rubric, one of the images there is a shoe. And what they did with the shoe is they made it look like not only was it sitting on a table, but that it had just like a little limited area of light on it, almost like a little spotlight on that shoe. So we not only see the shoe and its shadow that it's casting, but we also see where the light, that pool of spotlight is hitting the table surface and then where it's not. Okay, so you can kind of make up those details about the space, because chances of you finding an image that is sitting, on a surface in the way that you want is pretty minimal, right? Unless you create your own. Now, could you go home and take your cell phone and like photograph your toilet or something like that? Yeah, absolutely. Artists do that all the time. So you can do that as an option. But what's more likely going to happen is you're going to find within your 20 images today, you're going to find some sort of object that you like, that you feel like you could replicate highlights and shadows using colors. Okay, so for today, you're going to go on the computer, you're going to use your Google image search, okay, and you're going to search for whatever objects you choose, okay? So you're not going to go and type in Google ordinary objects, right? That's the part that you have to translate, you have to use your brain to do. We did that already yesterday. So you're going to pick some of those objects, and then you can type in something like faucet or something like flashlight. Okay, and then it's going to give you results, and then you're going to have to use your brain again and figure out, okay, this one is a cartoon, so I can't use that. This one, it has really even lighting. I want to use that one. That's not a strong example. This one, I can only see half of it, so that's probably not a good example. This one has really good highlights and shadows that I can see where the gradients are going to be. This one is a good one. I'm going to save that one. Does that make sense? Okay. How many images are you going to find? 20? Okay. 20, 20. They do not all have to be the same object, but if you, for example, let's say you really love the idea of a stool, okay? If you want to find several different pictures of several different stools, you may certainly do that. Does that make sense? Okay, so leave your stuff here, go ahead and head into the lab, log in, and then start your image research. And then we're going to print that today before you leave.
Yeah, just answer my question.
You didn't know
I did too.
I said, are we going to print them out?
Yes, you're going to print them because you're going to have that printout with you when you paint.